Okay, right. Well, we're just coming up to 3 o'clock here in the UK, so coming up to the hour. And thank you all for attending our live webinar this afternoon. We're focusing on enterprise portfolio management, and specifically, really, the how to implement matters just as much as the what. So, really thinking about how you go about setting up your enterprise portfolio management office and systems, some of the challenges that are in there that we see within the marketplace, and some thoughts about how you can address some of these challenges. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to do some introductions. I'm lucky to be joined today by Holger Royce. Holger and I actually know each other. We know each other for quite a long time now. In fact, worked together at HP for a while. We'll do the introductions. I'll introduce myself. I'll let Holger introduce himself and tell you a bit about his knowledge and his background, extensive experience in this sort of area. Then we'll look at the need for enterprise portfolio management, why it's becoming increasingly important, I believe, for organizations to really sort of focus on this to be successful into the future. We'll look at what some of the analysts are saying and what some of the challenges that they're seeing within the marketplace, and then we'll look at some of the typical issues that we see within there, and maybe some thoughts around how you can start addressing some of these issues. And Holger will take us through a particular client example. We'll try and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. If we can't cover everything, then we'll look to make sure we get back to you in terms of email responses and so on. If you do have some questions, you've got a little chat area that you can use. You can put those questions into that chat area so that we can see the questions as they come through. And we might take one or two as we actually work through the presentation, if we've got some time. But if not, we'll try and cover one or two at the end, or we'll get back to you later in terms of being able to do some of that. So let's move on actually into the presentation itself. So a little bit about me. My name is Steve Beaumont. I'm the regional manager for Innova Prime here in the UK, covering Ireland and the Nordics as well. I've been working in this whole area, I guess, for the last almost 20 years, working with a number of different software vendors who operate both in the PPM and the professional services automation, PSA space. And prior to that, a dozen years or more as a management consultant. I was at Deloitte, Coopers Lybrand, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young. So quite a lot of experience of working with businesses, both from the consulting side and also from the software side. A little bit about Innova Prime, very much sort of focused around fast-growing, innovative consulting company that's focused on some of this governance. So I'll touch on some of the software a little bit later on. We're all about trying to help companies to be successful in terms of implementing the business management systems that they need to support the organization. And specifically around some of the project and portfolio management space, we've a number of customers who have successfully implemented our Governance.Business solution in that area. As I say, I will touch on what the software can do a little bit later on, but let me hand you over now to Holger to introduce himself. Over to you, Holger.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you, Steve. My name, as Steve indicated, is Holger Royce. I'm working typically as an interim manager or as a consultant with different clients across the globe. At the moment, I'm the interim head of advisory and consulting for an organization called IPMO Advisory. That's a Swiss company, but I'm, as Steve, located in the UK, and given the nature of the business working globally, you see some of the light blue dots on the slide. So we have offices across the globe. I'm in the process of setting up the advisory and consulting businesses, working out offerings that IPMO would provide alongside the already existing training offerings. You have some of that information in the appendix. I don't want to go into detail. It's all associated with the Association of International Project Management Offices, where project management offices is a reflection of any PMO or PO or portfolio office you might have within the organization, from a project office up to an enterprise variant. I typically focus on the top-down considerations, but have done quite a lot of those over the years in the variations possible. So you see here some of the companies I have worked for in the past. So Steve mentioned we know each other for probably at least 15 years now, having worked together for Mercury and HP Software. I have worked for a number of those years in the software space alone in IBM, typically focusing on the strategic application of any software and consulting more around anything else but the software. So I wouldn't be someone you consider a technical architect or a technical configuration person. The biggest role I probably had over the years was for 5 years, the global lead for governance and portfolio management in Accenture. That I did until 3 years ago, where I started to work independent. And as I said, on the right-hand side at the moment, I'm focusing my work on IPMO advisory. One of the professional affiliations beyond the portfolio management, which is more obvious, is agnostic agile. So I've been, and you saw that with Rational Software probably, I've been through quite a lot of organizations, and I have my piece looking at it from a more agnostic perspective. Experiences, given the names you saw, there won't be many surprises on this slide. I do anything from a process perspective, so management of portfolios, managing successful programs, Prince2, Rational Unified Process, DSDM, Scrum. I'm a certified Scrum Master, if that is important for someone. I worked on a global agile transformation program using that. I'm trained in SAFe, done quite a lot of the service software. You see here CAPPM, HPPPM, ServiceNow, customer relationship software, Salesforce, Financial Force, Scoro. Some of those aren't on that list for a long time. I'm trying to exploit different options, what's available. Lately, I'm focusing on a PMO maturity model together with AI PMO, which is going to be going live relatively soon as a maturity assessment option. And I'm at the moment compiling my own enterprise portfolio management training, which is hopefully going live in January over a couple of days. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Holger. Right. So let's start moving on. Let's start thinking about the need for enterprise portfolio management. As I said at the start, it's becoming increasingly critical, I think, that organizations get something in place that will really help them to manage their change initiatives across the organization, to be able to execute on their strategy, whether it's just straightforward business strategy, whether there's more of a digital transformation going on. But I do think the role of enterprise portfolio management within organizations very much shifting to being a strategic need and more important across the whole organization. We've had a few more people join since we started. So I mentioned that if you do have some questions, then please do use the chat box within the system here to put your questions in there. We'll try and pick one or two up as we go. Or maybe at the end, see how much time we have left over. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so let's look at effective enterprise portfolio management and some of the benefits. Holger, talk me through some of this.
Yes, thanks, Steve. For me, when people look at enterprise portfolio management, first, I believe it's a relatively new discipline, has developed over the last 35 years, roughly. It started with IT project portfolio management, then eventually IT got dropped, and now we are in the process of dropping project management in there, and we move to an enterprise level, which for me indicates it's business as usual as much as change or projects we should be looking at. And in order to run it effectively, you should have what some people call an operating system, or some kind of system that's not a technology system in place that's supporting it. So beyond tooling, performance measures, governance arrangements, and so forth in place to run it. As the benefits typically from a top-down perspective, what you do achieve is aligning your investments to strategic objectives. For those of you who are UK-based, and I worked for a number of UK government organizations, they typically have 5 strategic objectives over a 5-year period in their strategic plan. So any of those projects or other investments you make ought to be possible to align to one of those strategic objectives. And I would advocate one, not multiple, because otherwise you lose some of the rigor that you should apply in the system. It does help you ultimately to focus the resource allocation. So resource, one of them is the financials, but also your critical resources, manpower you have available within your organization. The senior executives, if you go up the hierarchy, probably agree less and less with that. They will just say the option will be more expensive if we outsource delivery of one or the other projects. But ultimately, you cannot do any successful project without having internal business people available that help you understanding what you should be doing, how to do it, and then how to bring it to a live position. If you have portfolio management in place, ultimately, you will have some information and data available that you, and I assume you have a PMO or portfolio office or whatever you name it, that would be able to provide some insights and data on those points 1 and 2 here to the senior executives to guide them. So one of my clients, and you see later a slide of that, was Aviva, and we worked out what's the key difference after 18 months. And I said to my client at the time, your senior executives will understand what it means doing portfolio management with support with support by a system, and their decision-making process will be different. The target setting will be different. And that's all can be achieved by them making informed decisions how to calibrate the business on the highest level. So in that instance, when we went live with a system, they changed the ratio between run and change, or the projects versus the business as usual, depending on the language you use, from 70-30 to 50-50. That was the only different target they set, with quite significant changes for different parts in the organization.
Okay, excellent. So let's take a little look at then what the analysts are saying, Holger, what you picked up from here.
Yeah, and you see here, I put some quotes in by a number of companies. Probably all of you would know Gartner, Newswire, maybe less so. I found them quite significant and also reflective on the business I'm involved in. So quite a lot of customers I have been approached by as a consultant, or actually as someone in the delivery organization within a software environment. They do not understand really why they would want to implement a PPM tooling. And then some of them actually create issues for themselves in the life cycle, probably after the transformation, when we talk about execution, after they finished. So if you start with the implementation of a PPM solution, and the first step is implementing time management, that's certainly not where the big strategy investment should lie and where the biggest benefits are. I quite like the quote by MOP, Management of Portfolios. If you choose the wrong projects and do the wrong projects right, you still have done the wrong project, regardless what the outcome is of that. So you got to make sure you invest in PPM in the right way to make sure you get the right output of that and understand what's in it for you. So reflecting on the benefits we had earlier, like the strategic alignment. During the implementations, and you saw it, I worked for software companies as also consultants, there's typically a communication problem between the technical people who can focus on interfaces in making the software work, but understanding the business problems would be a good thing. Why you're doing it, what you're trying to achieve. Keeping it simple in the first place. You can complicate it over time, but focusing in, zooming in on what's the best value for you to add. And as I said, understanding the relevance and usage of the software after the implementation. When I get called up 2 years after the implementation, we've done A, B, and C, and we have forgotten quite why we've done it. Can you help us to recalibrate and make sure we get a good benefit from our overall investment? All three very typical scenarios I have been working with in the past.
No, I've seen a lot of that as well, Holger. So over the years, I must admit, I think at times people see software as being the answer, and software is actually, clearly the enabler. You have to do that more strategic thinking up front as to how you really want to get benefits out of the software, what the scope is in terms of really what you want to implement. A great deal of focus, as you say, has really just been around capturing some information about projects, but not thinking more strategically about how does that align back to the strategy. How do you group those into portfolios? How do you think of them in terms of the initiatives that you want to be able to deliver? And as you say, so many implementations do just end up being nothing more than a sort of glorified time recording system. And you're missing out on such a huge opportunity because there's so much value that you can get if you really think about what you need within the organization and how you can fine-tune your PPM system to really give you that information, to be able to support decision-making and so on within the organization. So yeah, it's how you go about it really is where you drive the value, absolutely. So why do we think this is the case? Talk to me a little bit more about some of the challenges and how you've seen some of this, and I'll give you some of my thoughts later on. Because obviously, with my background, both as a consultant and as a software vendor, I've got some views on this as well. So just take me through some of these challenges then, Holger.
Yeah, and I think probably Steve and I agree violently on almost everything you see here. You as potential buyers of a PPM solution, those who implement or those who have done actually an implementation already, you have specific challenges why you've been asked to do that. Large organizations all have to fulfill, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley, and have to understand from a CFO perspective where the investments are. You typically have some skills internally, but not all the required skills and expertise to implement best practice. So, going on a training course for, let's say, PMI Prince 2 gives you the manual, but making that manual into something for your specific organization is just one thing on top of that. Or then designing the specific process alongside that is another new discipline and goes also beyond just business process design. It's business process design for the inner operations of your organization. You have, more often than not, as we all know, politics and an organizational setup that's preventing you from getting to an optimal outcome and making changes to the organization. And then, you know, the strategic angle, what can, for example, the head of strategic planning do with the implementation of, for example, a PPM solution, what's possible, making that understood is typically also a skill set that's quite rare. My experience in the consultancies, there aren't really any specialist suppliers out there that would focus on this market if they're not associated with a very specific software vendor solution. And any, from the large ones, any PPM or PMO implementation will just be seen as another process improvement opportunity or a project management opportunity, but not zooming in on the specifics of what you are actually trying to achieve by implementing that. And it helps most of the clients who believe, well, we buy a PPM tool and we do a little bit of process design and that's that. From my experience, the biggest hurdles you have in order to make it work are governance arrangements, the culture within the organization where you do not want to standardize at all, or any arrangements with associated other internal departments who will be involved in it. And finance and HR just come to mind when you think about it. And I mentioned it before, some specialist providers are typically aligned only to one technology. So they're not really interested in providing you with consulting or advice if it is not for the benefit of implementing software. Now, software vendors, and I probably should leave that with Steve, but I've tried, still having been around that, you focus on the technical implementation, any process design, any training, any BAU consideration, i.e. the changes you have to make in order to go live, any cultural change are typically beyond the skill set of the workforce within the software vendors. And they don't do a visioning session with you. They don't design a target operating model and so forth. But I'm not as well placed as Steve to comment on that because he's closer.
Absolutely, Holger. Yeah, as I say, I've been working in this industry now for, as I say, nearly 20 years, and with a number of different software vendors. And I have to say, some are much better than others in terms of how they go about some of this. But you're right, the focus tends to be about configuration of the software. And if the client, the customer you're working with, has not really thought it through in terms of a more strategic need, then the danger is that it becomes a tactical solution. It really does focus more on supporting project delivery and thinks less, as you say, around the vision, around the governance, certainly around the business outcomes that you should be trying to drive with your investment in your project portfolio. So I think it's it's important to make sure that if you're putting in an enterprise PMO, that it's very much a business-driven PMO, that you understand what value means to the stakeholders, to the executives, and set up your PMO in that way. I was speaking to a lady a few weeks ago who was actually running a PMO, enterprise PMO within an organization, very frustrated. She felt that she was more a project support office. What she was tending to do was they were covering things that the project managers and the project teams didn't have time to do. So very much more administration. And was struggling because she wasn't getting sponsorship. She wasn't getting involvement from the executives. And that's a classic example where the focus is on the wrong things. If you want the execs to be properly sponsoring the initiatives that you're delivering, if they're really sort of going to focus on the PMO and the value that it's delivering, you need to make sure what's important to them, what they're looking for, what decisions that they're making, what information that they need to be able to support those decisions. And that should be your focus. I mean, I told her to think about having a conversation with them, potentially moving away from a lot of detail in terms of what was being captured within the system, and very much looked to drive the dashboards of the executives around the strategic initiatives that they're trying to drive out across the organization to really make sure that they are thinking about the business outcomes required and the information that they can get through the PPM system to allow them to achieve their business goals. So I think you really have to think about, really what's important for the organization and focus on that in terms of how you do your implementation. So let's go down to a level below this, Holger, and start looking at this from, you got it broken down to strategy, transformation, and execution. Let's start with strategy.
Yeah, so this is about the typical issues I came across in my career. You might agree, disagree, add up others, but that's what for me typically comes to mind. So before you start, typically, because of the nature of portfolio management being a relatively new discipline and not featuring on an awful lot of org charts almost, there's no common understanding what enterprise portfolio management should be. I saw quite a lot of org charts where it's sitting happily within IT management, but where's the correlation and the link up to the business? So it's a level below where it should be. It's a management discipline and it's relatively new. We had already a debate about the benefits that you can associate typically with enterprise portfolio management, but that might not be clear. And you would have to create a business case in order to derive that. Business and IT are not sharing the same objectives. That's actually a very positive formulation of one of the biggest issues you could come across, is that business and IT are not really talking to each other, despite all the appreciation of Agile and the urgent need to cooperate across the business for the benefit of your customers and ultimately your organization. So making sure you have that done is one of the key ingredients to derive maximum benefit of whatever you do in this space. Insufficient level of senior management engagement within the organization. So when you do implement portfolio management, you create a level of transparency. Not everybody is going to like that throughout the organization. If your senior management doesn't like it and doesn't support it, you will not be successful. Ideally, they understand what portfolio management should be. They understand their own role and they walk the talk and go out and follow it. And ultimately, your executive board, depending on your type of organization, your executive board would be top of the tree, providing targets downwards into the organization that will be broken down further as you go through the levels of hierarchy. So that's for me one of the key aspects of getting it right before you start. And I mentioned already the corporate culture might be counterproductive to effective standardized enterprise portfolio management. The word that's relevant here is standardized. And anything that is against standardization will not help you with portfolio management. You do not have to standardize everything in order to operate successful portfolio management, but some things you do have to do. And if the culture is of a nature where it says, no, we can't possibly do something that everybody else does as well, then you're not going to be successful. My question straight back would be, if your culture is so diverse that you do not find any common ground, why is it actually a company? Or if you start to do enterprise portfolio management and you don't believe to ultimately get to a level that's starting at the very top of your organization and you still operate in silos, the question again becomes, if you operate in silos, why are those silos not different organizations? Steve, anything to add on this?
No, I think that's a good point. I was thinking about, you know, the impact that silos can have on this when you were talking that through, and I think there is that danger. I mean, clearly nowadays there's huge risks in operating in silos. As you say, the only justification is if actually they are completely different divisions almost, and working to different strategies, in which case that might justify it. But outside of that, then really if they're working towards collective goals and collective business outcomes, then there's no way they should be operating in silos. They should be looking at how they can synergize, how they can work together more closely, become more operationally efficient in terms of delivering across the business and share information and share knowledge. I do think, again, it goes back to this, you know, business and IT not sharing the same objectives. I think there again, hopefully most IT organizations have moved on from that, but I've seen an awful lot of them in the past that really see themselves as just technology providers, whereas they should be now more internal consultancies that are working alongside people in other business units to think about how technology can be used to deliver the business outcomes that they need, and also helping with the innovation and being able to bring to the table discussions around new technology or upcoming technology and how that could potentially be applied across the organization to make you more operationally efficient or you know, help drive growth, bring new products to market and so on. So I think it really, you know, you really do have to look at, if you've got some of these challenges, just look at the culture, as you say, within the organization. And you need a top-down initiative that allows you then to start driving change and really become more productive across the organization.
Yeah, so, you know, just quickly coming back, the best examples, and I believe one of the industries where standardized portfolio management across the enterprise sort of is effectively in play, is pharmaceuticals. They have, however, very different arms or departments within that. If you think about R&D, they want to fail quickly and understand it's lost investment. It doesn't help if you fail the authorities at the third hurdle. Rather do it at the first. It's
agreed. Fail fast, move on.
Right? And once you have invented paracetamol, you want to produce it very, very cheaply and business as usual, because for 10 years you have the patent and you need to derive the benefits as much as possible. But they still can have a layer that's standardized across the piece. So you can still have all investment measured against ROI. You should have just different levels and hurdles of ROI.
Yeah, potentially. You might handle different portfolios differently, depending on, as you say, the nature of them. Yeah, okay.
So moving on to the next life cycle stage of your potential engagement on PPM or PMO, while you implement. Make no mistake, if you do an implementation typically of any robust and good PPM solution, it will almost feel as big and complex as an ERP solution. Actually, in some instances, it has proven in my past to be even worse, because ERP systems have different modules and allow you different entries for the same resources. The PPM solution is consistent in itself and does not allow for that. So you would even have to resolve lingering problems in your ERP system that are there for years before you can implement a PPM solution. Associated with that, I mentioned already finance, HR, enterprise architects. So you have a large stakeholder community that's sitting around the table. I have seen more often than not a stakeholder community. There were 20 people sitting around the table and 18 represented internal departments with a need to have checkpoints, gates, and God knows what implemented. and only 1 or 2 project managers or program managers. Now, I typically then assumed also the role of the project or program managers because I did feel they were underrepresented. Once the implementation has happened, the key users of the systems are the project and program managers. The data will come from them. And if they're not part in your setup during the implementation, and you focus on your internal departments, you will not be as successful as you potentially could be. I had one organization where they had created 29 internal checkpoints on their solutions delivery lifecycle because they couldn't agree gateways. So the project manager was managing through 29 checkpoints. An absolute nightmare if you are a project manager. And that's how the take-up then afterwards, after the implementation was, people just didn't believe in the solution. You also have a constant scope creep where people want this and that and also get away from the out-of-the-box software. Now, there is something to be said for out-of-the-box software. Typically, it has one process associated. You have to make changes in order to make it work for your organization. But you should keep it initially to the minimum that is required. Prioritize. Make sure you have the right scope. And be very thorough in assessing what can be added and what shouldn't be added. Rather keep it. Don't provide any solution that's customized and not for the benefit on an ongoing basis. And you have to make the changes again once the software gets updated, for example. I'm an absolute enemy of those implementations. Unclear pathway to effectively roll out of functionality. So discuss with your stakeholder community the priorities they have and take that into a rollout plan. Make sure you have a package of functionality that does make sense. And there are even software vendors out there that cannot observe that when they do their own changes. So it has to fit within your organization, what you do. Bundle it together with the changes HR, finance, EA want to do anyhow. But make sure it's all completely understand what the change impact is on the end user community. Undefined or ineffective processes. Well, the tooling typically helps you with that because as I tend to say, ETC, which is very nicely done on a process description on a Word document, the tool would not recognize that. It will ask you to provide a 100% solution. And if you have to replace ETC with others, you have at least done the first step. So make sure that any systems implementation does not get infected by undefined or ill-defined processes. And if you have a chance to dry run them for a couple of times before you animate them in the tool, that's even better. Processes you might get away to implement a couple of times, tooling only once. Once it fails, the end user community would lose faith and they go possibly back to using the Excel spreadsheets. Last but not least, there isn't or just an insufficient enterprise portfolio management tooling solution available, and you have chosen that, unfortunately, for your implementation. So there is some rigor required when you do the evaluation. I'm not sure what Steve's view is on that, but I found in the past that a lot of people focus on integrations and how easy it might be done or not, but that isn't the killer typically during the implementations or when the solution is being utilized. There are things more around possibly reporting and the capabilities of the tool, and ultimately how much configuration is actually allowed to make it work for your organization. if you have people who understand what they are doing.
No, I think that's right. Reporting, absolutely, very, very critical. As I said, you've got to get actionable information out in front of the executives so that they can really make the decisions that they need. I do agree. I mean, configuration, again, you want a piece of software that allows you to configure it, that you don't have to, as you say, customize it, that it is around configuration, but also respects that actually perhaps your needs will change over time as well. So you don't just really get locked down into a solution that can't grow and transform with you. Because if, your business will change, the information that you need across your organization will change, your maturity will change. And therefore, you need to have a solution that can grow with you, but also you need to have a partner in terms of the software provider that can also work with you through those processes as well. It's not a one-off installation, implementation, and off you go and you run with it forever. So it really has to be a business partnership. And clearly at Innova Prime, that's something that we're very keen to make sure that we do with it. Okay, so
right
after you finish, execution.
Yes. The lack of capabilities is probably relevant for all three stages, but after the implementation, it really comes to the fore if you can't operate the system you have implemented. It's the point in time where typically any suppliers at scale would leave and are no longer available to you. So one of the things I have been focusing on is that I work with customers to understand what needs to be there from their BAU perspective in order to maintain the system we have implemented. And that's not only the physical system, but the whole management arena around it. So for me, that's absolutely crucial to sustain success. There is, as I said, capabilities, expertise. You need to have a function within the organization. That's the last moment in time where it should be there. You have, following on from the cultural issues, a lack of adoption. People say, we don't want this, we can't do this. One of the very famous quotes is, oh, it's administration when we do planning. No, planning should be a core capability and everybody should do planning all the time, but it's admin. So if it's admin, I can't possibly spend my time on it. You will be bitten if you have the wrong focus during the initial implementation, like the wrong sequence, the wrong priorities, the wrong functionality going live at the wrong time of the year. You should start, if you ask me, at the beginning, which sounds simple, but it will have ramifications how you do it for now on the future use. And then obviously cost-saving pressures. You haven't got that little troop of consultants anymore. You have to get rid of them. You have to support it yourself. And the funds will almost be frozen for an ongoing support and enhancement. And that should be, if you start with under the mottos, let's keep it simple, you extend functionality over time. That's also implied in that. But if the cost-cutting pressures come to bite you, you will not have a complete solution. So, we've all seen it. What can you do to maintain your solution? Steve?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think you're right. I think it's, you don't want to over-engineer it at the start when you're trying to do the implementation. As part of your vision, you might want to make sure you're in, a vision for the future. You understand where you're trying to go, but don't engineer it right at the first phases of your implementation. But if you do take that approach, you can't just, sort of stop, as you say, cost saver, and then you don't deliver the rest of the vision that you had in the first place. I think that's a big danger, but it only gets half implemented. And then again, as you said before, the adoption levels will be low, the confidence in the system will be low, the system gets blamed when actually clearly it was the, the processes you put in there and the approach that you had to the implementation that was causing the problem. And I've seen companies that have put in various different pieces of software and still struggle with exactly the same problems because, again, it wasn't the software that was at fault, it was the way that they were going about it. So you do need to have the expertise. You do need to make sure you get a transfer of knowledge going in there as well, having the right people in the room as you're going through this process, that you can actually make the right decisions, but you can also transfer that knowledge internally to people who can then support the system going forward. That is critical as well, because you don't want to be in the hands of the software vendor. Software vendor clearly there to support you, but the knowledge and expertise needs to go into your organization, and that gives you the opportunity to grow and expand going forward. So, Holger, just talk to us a little bit about some of your past clients. And for those of you that can see, seeing this slide here, you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, there's a little arrow there that will take you to a video where you'll be able to go to YouTube and see Holger talking about some of his experiences in the past. We won't run that now, but we'll send the slides out to you and you can go in there and you can watch some of that and listen to Holger talking about some of the work that he has done. I believe it was Aviva on this particular one, but Holger, do talk us through some of your past clients.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve, again. So don't worry, it is on YouTube because HP had to take the marketing video off after 5 years when they renew it. It does give you some insights into what I helped doing at Aviva. As a consultant, you only are a supporting act ever. You're not actively doing it. But it gives you some insights, some of the project work I have already alluded to. You see here probably quite a strong emphasis on financial services. This is my background. This is where I feel most comfortable in talking about the processes and procedures. Having said that, anything around PMOs and portfolio management is actually agnostic and can be applied across the piece. So I have worked in quite a number of other organizations as well. The DVLA, I helped setting up portfolio management from an enterprise perspective. That's quite a few years back. Had to use MOP and Prince2. The Home Office, I was an interim manager for portfolio management. Some of the others like Borealis, I run senior management sessions to establish their maturity against the maturity model I have developed and provide back to them in a relatively short period of time suggestions for initiatives to address the issues they have at the moment on a roadmap. ÖMV is an Austrian company, similar probably to, if you are in the UK, Shell, where I helped designing program and project management processes and provide requirements for tooling. Unilever, I worked from a service management perspective. Morrison's, probably my very, very first PPM tooling implementation ever. So, as I said, a variety of those. It doesn't mention all those others where I was there for a smaller time engagement or when I just rolled in for a couple of hours to have a conversation with someone. Yeah, and one specific example we wanted to give you to see how diverse an engagement can be. And I tried to frame it in the same way as we did before. So you see here the situation the client was there. I had been part of their transformation process, so their implementation. A year and a half later, I was contacted, and what had happened was the software vendor and the big consulting team had left the client, and they had quite a lot of issues internally. And it manifested itself in, I believe they had 60 change requests, and they couldn't get to manage through that. Clearly, they identified that as an issue. We hadn't implemented the solution. It hadn't finished. It was sort of stuck between the transformation and the execution. One of the issues I identified when I spoke with them, there wasn't a clear strategy or roadmap what PPM should actually provide to the client going forward. And the stakeholders were frustrated because obviously each of them saw their own requirement as key to be resolved first. And if you don't work with me first to address that, then I'm not going to contribute to any other solution you might provide. And all the change requests ought to be undergoing a rigorous assessment for the root cause and what actually would provide the solution within PPM. So what the solution I proposed looked like was going back from a strategic perspective and have a look at what I had created together with the client, the vision and the strategy and the roadmap. How much did we achieve? What was left over? Why had that happen? And what do we need to learn from that for the future? And just revising that. Also important for the client at that point, updating the business case to ask for more funding to address what we had identified. From a transformation perspective, getting on top of all the change requests and just putting them on the roadmap for resolution today, in 90 days, longer term, never. And having just that done. And then from an execution perspective, working with the various stakeholders to understand their roles. So one of the issues I found out was that the ownership had changed. So someone suddenly was known to be the owner of the tool, someone was the owner of the process. Those weren't the owners during the transformation. They struggled with that concept. They needed help. They needed sitting alongside on what would I do if I were in your position. So you see that, and lots of my partners in the past, typically from a technical perspective, ask for what's the service package. I typically tend not to provide those because I believe that most of the clients with their problem are actually in a relatively unique situation and they require service elements that, like in this case, stretch across all three implementation stages. And you have to cut them to the needs of the customer. It might be very little in strategy once you are in execution, but you have to revisit that in order to make sure you're still on the right track. So that was one of the more interesting challenges, especially as I had been part of the strategy and the transformation when you get back called in 18 months later.
Yeah, that can be hard when you have to try and turn it around when you've reached that point. Clearly a lot better if you can get involved earlier on in the process. But a great example, Holger. Thank you. Okay, just conscious now we're getting close to the top of the hour. What I wanted to do was just give a little bit of insight into the Governance.Business business management platform. As we sort of talked about there, you know, portfolio management, a key element of that. But one of the unique things about the Innova Prime solution is the breadth of solution, integrated solution that we offer into the marketplace. And as you can see here, it can cover the sales management, the CRM piece within there, managing the pipeline, managing the projects as we see there. But it's also about having service management capability within the system as well, and starting to integrate all of this and focus around all of this, and being underpinned by the business process management capabilities within there. It really does allow you, as Holger was saying, to, if you think about those processes, if you make sure that you really are improving the way that you work, and then getting the software to underpin that and enable it to support the delivery of that, then I think that becomes critical. Having elements, things like quality management, document management, knowledge management that's coming through is critical with that. But we need to have all of that to make sure we can actually drive those reports and dashboards that are needed. You can capture the time. You do the financial management, which is critical, as well as making sure that you're using the right resources on the right projects at the right time. So, the Governance.Business solution, if you're not aware of it, I think is something that is relatively unique within the marketplace in terms of the scope of the functionality and the capabilities that it can offer within there and be able to support a business as you go through this process. And as you say, we back that up very much with a lot of knowledge and experience within the marketplace that can really help you achieve some of your goals within that. So as I say, in terms of some of the capabilities, it's got flexible structure in terms of the hierarchy, as how you can go around and actually sort of configure this. The configuration is key, but it does give you flexibility in terms of how you can go through and actually set that up, allowing multi-dimensional resource planning and tracking. You've got the flexibility and the power of the workflow with all the audit trails I was talking about there, which is critical for the governance processes that Holger was talking about, making sure that you can go through and support the different steps in the process and the gateways that you might have. But again, as we've touched on, don't overdo that. Try to make sure that it's you're not creating bottlenecks through the process as you go through and actually use some of these capabilities. But it can very much support whether you've got an enterprise PMO, you can have IT, you can be product related, you can be delivering actually services out to the end business. It's got this professional services capability within it as well, all within a single solution. And by pulling that through into one environment and allowing you to manage your business across all of these areas within a single integrated solution, it really does become something very powerful that can be configured to your own individual needs. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I did say if you had any sort of questions, you could put them into the chat area. I haven't received any so far, but if you have any questions now, it's a good chance for you just to put in some questions to Holger about what we've covered off today, or myself from Innova Prime's perspective. If not, the intention was that we would stop a little bit before the top of the hour, because if you've got another meeting, there's nothing worse than having to run from one room to another to be able to get there. So it doesn't look as though we've got any questions at the moment, Holger. But if you do have questions, please do send them through. We'll be more than pleased to respond to those, to send the answers out. What we are going to do, and you've got emails here for both myself and for Holger, if you want to be able to send these through. The slides will be sent out to you so that you can go through and re-look at some of those slides, and also the recording will become available. I think that will be available next week, because obviously clearly we're Thursday night now. Work on the recording on Friday and make it available for people next week. So I hope you found that interesting. Holger, thank you very much. That was excellent. It was great to get some of your knowledge and insight into this area. It clearly is a challenging area for a lot of organizations. They don't necessarily get it right first time when they're putting an enterprise PMO in place. And they do need to sort of go back, revisit it, think about just really what they want to achieve and how they need to go about it. And your thoughts and insights into that, I think, have been excellent. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Holger.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.